The stagecoach rolled into Dusty Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1878, trailing a plume of copper-colored dust behind it like the tail of a comet nobody had asked for. And every soul on Main Street stopped what they were doing to watch the door swing open and reveal a woman the likes of which this sun-scorched corner of the world had never seen. She stepped down from the coach with the careful grace of someone who had been told that the ground beneath her feet would be entirely foreign, and she was right. Her traveling dress was a deep burgundy wool, slightly rumpled from days of hard riding, and her dark hair was pinned beneath a small hat that was tilted at an angle that suggested the journey had done its best to undo her dignity, and she had refused to let it. She carried a single trunk, a worn leather valise, and an expression that managed to be both frightened and determined in equal measure. She looked around at the unpainted storefronts, the horses tied at hitching posts, the men in dusty hats staring at her openly, and she pressed her lips together and lifted her chin. Her name was Gertrude Hart. She was 24 years old. She had sailed from Lyon, France to New York, and then ridden trains and stagecoaches for 3 weeks to arrive here. And she had come because she had answered an advertisement in a French-language newspaper published in New Orleans, an advertisement placed by a land broker on behalf of a Texas rancher named Cecil Carson who was seeking a wife. She had not expected Texas to be this color. Everything was brown and gold and bleached white, as though the sun had spent years pressing all the green out of the land, and the sky above it was so enormous and so blue that it made her feel small in a way that even the Atlantic Ocean had not quite managed. She stood beside her trunk and clutched her valise and looked up and down the street, searching for someone who might be the man whose formal, carefully written letter had convinced her to leave everything she had ever known. Cecil Carson was 30 years old, 6 feet tall in his boots, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water running over smooth gray stones. He was standing on the boardwalk outside the general store when the stagecoach arrived, and he had been standing there for the better part of an hour, which was not something he would ever have admitted to anyone. He had taken off his hat and put it back on twice already. He watched the woman step down from the coach and felt something in his chest rearrange itself without asking his permission. He had written that letter 6 months ago at the suggestion of his neighbor, old Emmett Prout, who had told him that a man alone on a ranch was a man slowly going to ruin, and that what Cecil needed was a partner, a woman with grit enough to make a life in a hard country. Cecil had written the letter honestly, describing the ranch, the work, the isolation, the fact that Dusty Creek was a town that had ambitions larger than its current reality, and that any woman who came here would need to be the kind of woman who could make something out of very little. The broker had matched him with Gertrude Hart of Lyon, and her photograph, a small oval portrait in which she looked directly at the camera with steady dark eyes, had been sitting on his fireplace mantel for 4 months. He walked toward her now, turning his hat over in his hands, and she saw him coming and squared her shoulders in a way that made something in his chest do that rearranging thing again. "Miss Hart," he said, and then stopped, because he had suddenly realized he did not know a single word of French, and she had suddenly realized that the man walking toward her with the hat in his hands and the creekwater eyes was going to speak to her in a language she barely understood, because her English consisted of approximately 12 words, none of which were particularly useful at this moment. "Bonjour," she said carefully, and then, because she had rehearsed this on the stagecoach, added, "Je suis Gertrude Hart." Cecil stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him. The entire town of Dusty Creek seemed to hold its breath. "Cecil Carson," he said, and pressed his hand to his chest. She looked at his hand on his chest and then at his face and understood that this was his name and that he was introducing himself, and something in her own chest loosened very slightly. She extended her gloved hand, and he took it and shook it carefully, the way a man shakes the hand of someone he is hoping very much not to disappoint. "Welcome to Texas," he said, and she did not understand a single word of it, but she understood the tone, which was gentle and a little nervous, and that was enough for now. The town of Dusty Creek had a population of approximately 300 people, a church, a saloon, a general store run by a man named Horace Webb, a doctor who was rarely sober before noon, a schoolhouse, and a telegraph office that had been installed 2 years prior, and was regarded by most residents as either the greatest miracle of the modern age or a source of endless trouble, depending on who you asked. It also had, as of that afternoon in October of 1878, one French woman who could not speak English, and one Texas rancher who could not speak French, and the two of them stood together on the boardwalk in a silence that was awkward and enormous and somehow, in a way that neither of them could have explained, not entirely unpleasant. Cecil had arranged for Gertrude to stay at the boarding house run by a widow named Clara Abbott for the time being, which was the arrangement he had described in his letters as proper and respectful, giving both of them time to become acquainted before any formal ceremony. His letters had been translated through the broker, and so he had not known until this moment that the gap between them was not merely geographic and cultural, but was also, and most urgently, linguistic. He loaded her trunk into his wagon and drove her to Clara's boarding house, and he sat on the seat beside her while she looked out at everything with those steady dark eyes, and the silence between them was filled with the sound of horse hooves on packed earth, and the distant bawling of cattle and the wind moving through the dry grass on either side of the road. Clara Abbott was a practical woman of 52 who had survived widowhood, a drought, and 3 consecutive bad harvests, and she looked at Gertrude Hart with the assessing eye of someone who knew what it cost a woman to arrive somewhere new and have to start from nothing. She took Gertrude's hands in hers and squeezed them and said, in a voice that was warm and deliberate, "You are welcome here." And Gertrude understood none of the words but understood everything about the tone, and her eyes went a little bright before she blinked it away. Cecil stood in the doorway of Clara's parlor with his hat in his hands and explained the situation as briefly as he could. "She doesn't speak English," he said. Clara looked at him. "Well," she said, "you had better learn French." He opened his mouth and closed it again. He looked at Gertrude, who was standing very straight in the parlor looking at a framed sampler on the wall that read "Home is where the heart is," a sentiment that must have struck her as either comforting or unbearably ironic given the circumstances, and he felt the weight of what he had done settle onto his shoulders. He had invited a woman to cross an ocean and a continent for him, and he had not thought to learn a single word of her language. "Is there anyone in town who speaks French?" he asked. Clara considered. "Father Beaulieu at the church speaks it. He's from Quebec. Mostly he speaks Latin, though, at this point." Cecil put his hat back on. "I'll go talk to him." He went to the church and found Father Beaulieu, a spare, white-haired man of about 65, in the process of mending a hymn book with a needle and thread. The priest looked up at Cecil with the mild expression of a man who had heard a great many confessions and was no longer surprised by human foolishness. "Father," Cecil said, "I've got a situation." He explained the situation. Father Beaulieu listened and set the hymn book aside and said, in excellent English with a slight French cadence, "I see. And what is it that you would like from me? I need someone to translate for now, and I need to learn French fast." The priest looked at him for a long, considering moment. "You want to learn an entire language," he said. "Yes. Because of a woman you have not spoken to." "Yes." Father Beaulieu smiled, and it was a smile that contained a great deal of knowledge about human beings. "Come tomorrow morning," he said. "We will begin." The next morning, Cecil arrived at the church at 7 o'clock, and Father Beaulieu sat him down with a primer and a patience that seemed inexhaustible, and they worked for 2 hours before Cecil had to go back to the ranch for the day's work. He rode home with the word bonjour rattling around in his head, and a list of basic vocabulary written in his cramped handwriting on a scrap of paper in his shirt pocket. That afternoon, Father Beaulieu walked to Clara's boarding house and introduced himself to Gertrude in French, and she responded with such visible relief at hearing her own language that the priest had to blink a few times himself. He explained Cecil's plan, that Cecil was learning French, that it would take time, and that in the meantime the priest would serve as an intermediary when necessary. And he also began, quietly and without making much of it, to teach Gertrude some English. Gertrude sat at Clara's kitchen table that evening and looked at the list of English words Father Beaulieu had written out for her, and she thought about the man with the creek-water eyes who was, apparently, sitting somewhere on his ranch at this moment learning French for her, and she felt something that she was not yet ready to name, but that settled in her chest like the warmth of a fire in a cold room. The arrangement settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. Cecil would spend part of each morning at the church with Father Beaulieu, learning verbs and nouns and the peculiar music of French pronunciation, which he was not naturally gifted at, but which he worked at with the same stubborn diligence he applied to everything else in his life. He would write words on scraps of paper and carry them in his pockets, and read them while his cattle grazed, or while he was mending fence line, or while he was eating his supper alone at his table in the evening. He began to dream in fragments of French, words floating loose from their meanings, and he would wake up and write them down in the notebook he now kept on his bedside table. He came to town every few days to collect supplies or conduct ranch business, and on those days he would stop at Clara's boarding house, hat in hand, and visit with Gertrude in the parlor, and they would try to talk to each other. These conversations were exercises in patience and creative interpretation. Cecil would attempt a French phrase, and Gertrude would either understand it or politely correct his pronunciation, and Gertrude would attempt an English sentence, and Cecil would lean forward with his elbows on his knees and concentrate on understanding it the way a man concentrates on a puzzle he is determined to solve. In late October, Cecil brought Gertrude a small bouquet of wildflowers he had found growing along the creek on his property, yellow ones he did not know the name of in either language. He held them out to her and said very carefully, "Pour vous," which Father Beaulieu had taught him meant for you, and he said it with an accent that was entirely Texas and not at all French, but the meaning came through with complete clarity, and Gertrude took the flowers and said, "Merci," and then added in careful English, "Thank you," and smiled at him. It was the first real smile he had seen from her, not the careful, polite expression she wore when she was managing an unfamiliar situation, but an actual smile that reached her eyes and crinkled the corners of them, and Cecil Carson, who was not a man given to sentiment, had to look at the window for a moment to compose himself. Clara noticed. Clara noticed everything. She was fond of both of them in the way a practical woman becomes fond of people she can see are genuinely trying, and she invited Cecil to stay for supper that evening, which she did by appearing in the parlor doorway and saying, "Supper's ready," which Gertrude did not understand until Cecil mimed eating, and then she understood and laughed, and it was the first time either of them had made the other laugh, and it felt like a small door opening somewhere. Clara's suppers were plain but generous, roast chicken and potatoes and biscuits, and the four of them sat at the table, Clara and Father Beaulieu and Cecil and Gertrude, and Father Beaulieu translated back and forth while they ate, and Cecil learned that Gertrude had grown up in Lyon in a family of silk weavers, that her father had died 2 years before and her mother the year before that she had 2 brothers who were already married and established, and that the household she had grown up in no longer had room for an unmarried daughter of 24 without prospects, and that the advertisement in the New Orleans paper had seemed to her not a last resort, but something closer to a door that someone had left open for her, a possibility she had chosen deliberately rather than fallen into by accident. Cecil listened to all of this through Father Beaulieu's translations and watched Gertrude's face while she talked, the way her hands moved when she described the silk looms, the way she looked directly at whoever she was talking to with those steady dark eyes that did not flinch from anything, and he thought that he had spent a year wondering what kind of woman would answer his letter, and the answer was a braver one than he had expected. He told her about the ranch, 40 acres of good grassland and poor scrub, a creek that ran clear most of the year, a house he had built himself with 2 rooms and a covered porch and plans for more rooms that kept getting deferred by more pressing work. He had been ranching since he was 18, first on someone else's land and then on his own, and he had never quite figured out how to make the house feel like anything other than a place where he slept between days of work. He hoped, and he said this through Father Beaulieu's translation, with a directness that came from not having the vocabulary to be subtle, that she might know how to do that better than he did. Gertrude listened to this and looked at Cecil for a moment and said, in French, something that Father Beaulieu translated as, "A house needs someone in it who plans to stay." Cecil met her eyes across the table and said, "I plan to stay." Father Beaulieu translated this, and Gertrude looked at Cecil for a long moment and then said, in very careful, deliberate English, "I also." The next morning, Cecil arrived at the church and told Father Beaulieu he wanted to learn more than vocabulary. He wanted to be able to have a real conversation. He wanted to understand her when she spoke quickly, when she was excited or upset or just talking naturally the way a person talks when they forget to be careful. He wanted to learn the language the way she spoke it, not as a list of words but as something that flowed. Father Beaulieu looked at him over the tops of his spectacles and said, "That will take considerably more time." "Then we had better use the time we have," Cecil said. November came with a cold wind that swept down from the north and stripped the last of the leaves from the cottonwood trees along the creek. Gertrude helped Clara with the boarding house, with cleaning and cooking and mending, work she had been raised to and was good at. And Clara taught her English the way you teach a child, pointing at things and naming them. And Gertrude had the kind of quick, organized mind that had grown up learning the complex patterns of silk weaving, and she absorbed language with a determination that was, at its core, the same determination she brought to everything. She also began to learn the rhythms of Dusty Creek. She learned which hours the general store was quiet enough to browse without feeling stared at, and she learned that Horace Webb, the storekeeper, spoke slowly and clearly when he saw her coming, and she learned that the blacksmith's wife, a stout woman named Rosa Garza, whose family had been in Texas for 2 generations, sometimes brought tamales to Clara's back door on Fridays and stayed to share them, and spoke to Gertrude in Spanish, which Gertrude did not speak either. But their mutual enjoyment of the tamales constituted a friendship that required no translation. She learned that the town had opinions about her. Most of those opinions were expressed at a distance, the curious looks from people on the street, the whispered conversations that stopped when she passed. Some people were simply curious. The arrival of a French mail order bride was, objectively, an unusual event for Dusty Creek. A few people were less kind, and once, in early November, she heard a man outside the general store say something in English that she did not fully understand but whose tone was unmistakable, and she squared her shoulders and walked past him with her chin up and her eyes forward, the way she had learned to walk since arriving here, like a woman who knows the ground is foreign but refuses to apologize for standing on it. Cecil heard about this incident from Clara, who heard about it from Rosa Garza, and he was in town the following day, which was not his usual day, and he stood outside the general store for a while in the way that cowboys stand when they are being very deliberate about being visible, which was its own kind of message in a town this size. And the man in question did not say anything of that nature again where anyone could hear it. Gertrude did not know about this specifically, but she noticed that Cecil was there, and she noticed the expression on his face, which was quiet and careful and protective, and she filed it away in the part of herself that was keeping a careful account of who this man was. He was, she was discovering, a man of considerable action and very little unnecessary speech, which was a type she recognized from her father, who had been the same way. He showed up when he said he would. He did what he said he would do. He was learning French with a seriousness of purpose that she found difficult to reconcile with the image she had formed, from newspaper stories and travelers' accounts, of rough American frontiersmen, and she found herself revising that image daily. He also, she had observed, was very good with horses. He had brought his horse to the hitching post outside Clara's one afternoon when he came to visit, and she had gone out to look at it while he was talking to Clara. And the horse was a big bay gelding who turned his head to her and pricked his ears, and she had put her hand on his neck and he had leaned into it. And when Cecil came out and saw this, he had smiled at the horse and then at her and said, in careful French with his Texas accent, "Il vous aime. He likes you." She had looked at Cecil and said, "Et toi, and you." The words had come out before she decided to say them, which surprised her, and she watched Cecil's face carefully as he worked out the French, and she saw the moment he understood, and his expression did something complicated and warm and very honest, and he said, "Oui," and then in English, so she would know he meant it in both languages, "Yes." December arrived and the question of the wedding was still, technically, unresolved. There had been a plan, the plan written in the broker's letters, that there would be a brief courtship period followed by a ceremony, but neither Cecil nor Gertrude had yet raised the subject directly, and Father Beaulieu, who was both their language teacher and their would-be officiant, was wise enough to let things develop at their own pace. What was developing, anyone with eyes could see, was something that did not need the broker's plan. It was developing in the afternoons at Clara's kitchen table when Cecil and Gertrude sat across from each other and practiced conversation, taking turns speaking in the other's language, and laughing when they made mistakes, which they both did frequently and with increasing good humor. It was developing in the way Cecil had started bringing her things, a length of blue ribbon he saw in the general store and thought she might like because it matched something she wore, a small book of botanical illustrations he found in a box of donated items at the church, because she had expressed admiration for the wildflowers along his creek. It was developing in the way Gertrude had started asking Clara questions about the ranch, practical questions about the kitchen garden and the winter stores, questions that were really questions about what it would mean to live there. One afternoon in mid-December, when the sky outside was the kind of flat gray that meant weather coming, Cecil arrived at Clara's and found Gertrude alone in the parlor with a piece of paper on the table in front of her covered in her neat handwriting, both French and English words side by side in her careful columns, like a dictionary she was making for herself. He sat down across from her and looked at the paper, and she pushed it toward him so he could see, and he leaned over it and read and then looked up at her. "You are teaching yourself," he said, in French that was now genuinely competent, rough at the edges but fluent enough to carry a real thought. "We are teaching each other," she said, in English that had grown considerably since October, still careful but no longer labored. He looked at her across the table, and the gray winter light came through the window and lay across her face and her dark hair and the paper between them, and he said, in French, speaking carefully because this mattered too much to get wrong, "I would like you to see the ranch, if you want to. I would like for you to see where I live before we decide anything." She understood every word. She had been learning his language the way he had been learning hers, with the same stubborn devotion, and she met his eyes and said, "Yes, I want to see." He drove her out to the ranch on a Saturday morning in December, just 2 days before Christmas. Clara had insisted Gertrude borrow her good wool coat, and Gertrude sat beside Cecil on the wagon seat wrapped in Clara's coat and her own scarves, and the cold was a dry Texas cold that bit at the cheeks and the nose but left the sky clear and enormous above them. He showed her everything. The barn with its smell of hay and horses and worn leather, the chicken coop and the kitchen garden, mostly dormant now but laid out with a care that told her he had thought about it seriously. The creek, running clear and cold over smooth rocks, with a stand of bare cottonwood trees on one bank that in summer, he told her, were full of birds. The covered porch that ran the length of the front of the house and faced west, so that in the evenings you could sit and watch the sun go down over the flat land, and the sky would turn colors that had no names. And then the house itself. 2 rooms, as he had said, a main room with a fireplace and a table and chairs, and a bookshelf with a modest collection of books, and a bedroom. He had cleaned it, she could see that, with the thoroughness of a man who does not clean often enough but who, when he does it completely. There was a braided rug on the floor and curtains on the windows that looked like they had been hung recently and not entirely evenly, and she thought about him hanging those curtains before she arrived and felt something twist in her chest in the most particular and tender way. She stood in the middle of the main room and turned around slowly, looking at everything, and he stood near the door with his hands at his sides, watching her face the way a man watches a jury. "Il manque quelque chose," she said, and then, catching herself, translated, "It is missing something." "What?" he asked. She thought for a moment, choosing the English carefully. "Everything that has not happened yet," she said. "The years, the meals, the things that make a room remember people." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire in the fireplace was going and the light from it moved across his face. "Gertrude," he said, and it was the first time he had said her name directly, not Miss Hart, not with a formality that kept distance, just her name, and the way he said it made it sound like something valuable. "Will you stay?" She knew what he was asking. She had known this question was coming, and she had been having a conversation with herself about the answer for 6 weeks, and she had reached a conclusion that surprised her in its clarity. She looked at the fireplace and the uneven curtains and the bookshelf and the braided rug, and she looked at the man who had spent 2 months learning her language word by word because he had not wanted her to feel alone in his world, and she said, "Oui, je reste. Yes, I am staying." They were married 3 days later, on Christmas morning, by Father Beaulieu in the church of Dusty Creek, in a ceremony that was conducted partly in French and partly in English and partly in Latin, which neither of them spoke but which felt appropriately solemn for the occasion. Clara Abbott was there, and Rosa Garza, and Emmett Prout, the neighbor who had suggested the whole idea and who cried at weddings in a way that contrasted remarkably with his weathered exterior. Horace Webb from the general store. A dozen other townspeople who had watched this unusual courtship with interest and had come to have opinions about its outcome that were, mostly, warm. Gertrude wore her burgundy traveling dress, which Clara had pressed and which looked better for it, and she had the blue ribbon Cecil had given her tied in her hair. And when she walked down the aisle of the small church to where Cecil stood in his good coat with his hat held at his side, he looked at her with an expression so unguarded and so full of something enormous that she had to breathe carefully to keep her eyes from filling. Father Beaulieu asked the questions of the ceremony in both languages, which meant it took twice as long as usual, and no one minded at all. When Cecil said, "I do," and then immediately said, "Oui, je le veux," because he had asked Father Beaulieu to teach him that phrase specifically, and Gertrude said, "Oui, je le veux," and then in English, "I do," the whole church made a soft collective sound, not quite a cheer, something more like a sigh, the sound of a room full of people watching something resolve itself beautifully. He kissed her for the first time in front of God and Dusty Creek and the uneven winter sunlight coming through the church windows, and it was brief and gentle and entirely sincere, and she put her hand against his chest and felt his heart beating fast underneath her palm, and she thought, "Good. He is as frightened and as certain as I am. That is the right balance for 2 people beginning something." The winter on the ranch was hard the way Texas winters are hard, not buried in snow but grinding and relentless and gray, with cold that came in through the gaps in the walls and mornings when the water in the basin near the bed had a skin of ice on it. Gertrude learned the rhythms of the ranch the way she had learned the rhythms of the silk loom in her childhood, with her hands and her body before she learned them with her head, understanding the sequence of tasks through repetition before she understood why each one mattered. She learned to build a fire properly in the stove, the careful layering of kindling and wood, the management of the damper. She learned to make biscuits that actually rose, which was harder than it looked, and which she accomplished through a combination of instruction from Clara during 2 afternoon visits and her own methodical trial and error. She learned the chickens' individual personalities, which ones were aggressive and which ones were cooperative, and she named them all in French and told Cecil their names, and he made a genuine effort to remember them, which she found enormously funny. Cecil, watching her make herself at home in his kitchen and his yard and his life, felt a warmth expanding in him that he had not known was possible in this house, had not known was possible in him specifically. A man who had been so long alone that he had almost forgotten aloneness was a state to be departed from. She changed the house by being in it. Not with objects, though she did quietly rearrange a few things and add a small vase on the table that she filled with dried grasses and seed heads, but with her presence, which had weight and warmth and intention, and which made every room feel inhabited in a way it had not been before. In January, during a cold spell that kept them both close to the fire for 3 days straight, they talked. They talked for hours at a stretch, and the talking was now mostly in a kind of hybrid. Cecil in French when he had the French, and in English when he did not. Gertrude in English when she had it, and in French when she did not. And they had reached a point where each of them could follow the other through both languages with enough ease that the conversation did not stop. It just shifted registers, the way a river shifts course around an obstacle but keeps moving. She told him about Lyon, about the feel of silk thread between her fingers, about the sound the looms made, that rhythmic clapping that had been the background music of her entire childhood. She told him about her mother, who had been a serious woman with a dry sense of humor and a gift for pastry, and about her father, who had been quiet and steady and whose hands were always moving, always making something or mending something, who had died of a fever in the spring of 1876 with a composure that had broken her heart and strengthened her at the same time. She told him about the brothers who meant well but had their own families and their own problems, and had looked at her, unmarried at 24 in a house that was no longer truly hers, with the particular helpless guilt of people who cannot solve a problem, and so prefer not to look at it directly. Cecil listened to all of this and said very little while she was talking, because he understood that some things needed to be said and witnessed rather than responded to, and this was a thing his own quiet nature had taught him. When she was finished, he said, "You were brave to come here." She considered this for a moment. "No," she said, "I was practical." Brave would have been staying and fighting for something. Coming here was choosing a door that was open rather than a wall. "That still takes something," he said. "It takes willingness," she said. "I am not sure that is the same as bravery." He looked at her in the firelight. "I think you are braver than you know," he said. "I think you have been doing brave things so long they feel ordinary to you." She looked at him for a long moment and said nothing, and then said, "You are unexpectedly perceptive for a man who once tried to tell me the chicken was named Henriette when he meant the horse." He laughed and she laughed, and the fire popped, and outside the cold wind moved over the Texas plains, and inside the 2-room house on Cecil Carson's 40 acres it was warm. In February, Emmett Pruitt's wife fell ill with a bad cough that kept her in bed for 2 weeks, and Gertrude, hearing about this from Cecil who heard it from Emmett, went over with a pot of soup without being asked, because it was the obvious thing to do, and she was a woman who did the obvious kind and necessary thing without making a production of it. She sat with Mrs. Pruitt, a thin woman named Dorothea who was 70 and had been in Texas for 40 years and remembered when it was a different country, and they talked in the slow, careful way of people without a shared language who have nevertheless decided to have a conversation. And Dorothea Pruitt held Gertrude's hand and said, in a voice roughened by coughing, "That young man of yours has never been so bright about the eyes. You have done something good for him." Gertrude understood enough of this to understand the sentiment, and she squeezed the old woman's hand and said, in English, "He has done something good for me." Spring came late that year, not arriving in earnest until April, and when it came, it transformed the land in a way that made Gertrude understand, for the first time, what this country was actually capable of. The dry brown grass turned green almost overnight, and the wildflowers appeared in quantities she had not expected, yellow and purple and white, and the particular orange of the Indian paintbrush, scattered across the hillsides and along the creek bank with a lavishness that felt, after the months of winter brown, like an extravagance, like the land showing off. She stood on the porch one April morning with her coffee and looked out at all of it, and Cecil came to stand beside her and looked out at it too, and she said, "I did not know it would be beautiful." "Most people don't," he said, in French, which was now genuinely fluent, not perfect. It would never be perfect, but real and living and capable of holding what he meant. "They come in summer or winter and they see the hard part. The spring is what you earn it with." She looked at him. "How long did it take you to love it?" He thought about this honestly, which she appreciated about him, that he did not give quick answers to real questions. 3 years, he said. "The first year I was just surviving. The second year I was starting to understand it. The third year I looked up one morning and realized I would not go anywhere else." She looked back out at the green land and the flowers and the enormous sky. "I am only in my first year," she said. "Then you have time," he said. He put his hand over hers where it rested on the porch railing, and she turned her hand over so she was holding his, and they stood like that in the morning light with the spring laid out before them, and she thought, "I have time. I have all the time there is here with this man, in this strange and beautiful and difficult country I have chosen." She was pregnant by April, which she suspected before she knew, and which she told Cecil on a May evening when the supper dishes were washed, and they were sitting on the covered porch watching the sun go down in the colors that had no names. She told him in both languages simultaneously, French and English at the same time, which was something she did sometimes when a thing was too important to trust to only one tongue. He was very still for a moment after she said it. Then he put down his coffee cup very carefully on the arm of the chair, as though he was being precise about where it went, and then he turned and looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, something that was joy so large it had nowhere to go yet, that was still finding its shape. "Vraiment, truly," he said. "Vraiment," she confirmed. He got up from his chair and knelt down in front of hers, and took both her hands in his, and she looked down at him kneeling there on the porch boards in the spring dusk, and felt her eyes go hot and bright. "Gertrude," he said, and that was all he said, just her name, in the way that had her name in it but also everything else, everything he was trying to say that he did not have words for in either language. "I know," she said. "I know." The summer of 1879 was a busy summer on the ranch. Cecil added a room to the house, a proper bedroom for when the baby came, which he worked on in the evenings and on Sunday afternoons with Emmett Pruitt's assistance, and the sound of hammering became the background sound of those long summer evenings. Gertrude planted a kitchen garden, a real one, with vegetables and also with herbs she had ordered from a seed catalog she had found at Horace Webb's general store, and she grew thyme and lavender and tarragon, things that had no real business being in Texas but which she coaxed into existence through sheer attention, and which made the kitchen smell, in late summer, like a corner of Lyon had been transported improbably across the Atlantic. Father Beaulieu came to supper regularly now, because he was old and sometimes lonely, though he would never have said so, and because their table was always generous and the conversation was interesting. He had watched, with the satisfaction of someone who has contributed to something good, as Cecil's French developed from halting vocabulary into real language, and as Gertrude's English became, by summer, something she could have a long conversation in without stopping to think too hard. One August evening, Father Beaulieu arrived for supper and found them in the kitchen having a discussion, animated and fast, switching back and forth between French and English with the ease of two people who had, somehow, built a shared language between them that was not exactly either one, a private language of two people who had learned each other. He stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to them for a moment before they noticed him, Cecil gesturing with a wooden spoon and Gertrude responding with her hands, both of them talking at once and understanding each other. And the old priest felt something in him relax that he had been holding tight for a long time, some anxiety about whether this was going to work, some question about whether two people from such different worlds could actually find each other across all that distance. And the answer was clearly yes. The answer was in this kitchen, arguing cheerfully about whether the beef stew needed more salt, and he stepped inside and said bonsoir, and they both turned and welcomed him in. The baby came in November of 1879, a boy, strong and indignant from the first moment, with Cecil's dark hair and Gertrude's steady dark eyes, and they named him Edouard after Gertrude's father, with Cecil's last name of course but with Gertrude's father's first name, which was a decision Cecil had made without any prompting, which she learned only when she heard him say the name aloud to Father Beaulieu after the birth, and which made her cry in a way she had not cried since arriving in Texas. Big releasing tears that were not at all sad, that were in fact the opposite of sad, that were the tears of a woman who had been holding a great deal of grief and gratitude in the same place for a long time and had finally found someone safe to let it go with. The winter of 1879 passed with Edouard in the house, and a baby is perhaps the most efficient language teacher in existence, because a baby does not care about linguistic barriers. It has needs and it communicates them with perfect clarity, and the two of them caring for this small demanding person together, in whatever combination of French and English and pantomime was required, became a kind of fluency in itself, a shared fluency in the specific language of this child, this family, this life. Cecil would sit in the chair by the fire in the evenings with Edouard and talk to him in French, because Father Beaulieu had said with authority that the child should grow up with both languages, and Cecil would recite French words and then English words, and then make up songs in both that were not musically distinguished, but that Edouard seemed to enjoy. And Gertrude would sit across the room and watch her husband singing to their son in her language, in the language he had learned for her, word by word, before he had ever heard her speak it, and she felt something that was beyond gratitude and beyond love, and was really just the settled, permanent, daily fact of being where she was, supposed to be with who she was supposed to be with. Spring of 1880 brought with it a development that neither of them had planned for, a new neighbor, a family named Beaumont from Louisiana, a father and mother and 3 children, arrived and took up the homestead 2 miles east of Cecil's property. The mother, Josephine Beaumont, was Creole, and she spoke French with a Louisiana accent that was different from Gertrude's Lyon French but was unmistakably French. And the 2 women stood in Josephine's newly established kitchen the day of the introduction, and looked at each other, and began talking in French at a pace that made Cecil, standing in the doorway, feel briefly that he had gone back to being the man who could not understand a word, which lasted approximately 30 seconds before he picked up the thread and followed it, which made him feel unreasonably pleased with himself. Josephine Beaumont became Gertrude's first real friend in Texas, a friendship of 2 women who had both come to this country from French-speaking worlds and had both built something in the strange, hard, beautiful landscape of the frontier. And they visited back and forth, and their children, once there were more of them, played together in the creek in summer and shared Christmases, and made the particular kind of friendship that grows between women who recognize in each other someone else who knows what it costs to start from nothing somewhere new and to choose, every day, to stay. In the summer of 1880, a circuit court judge came through Dusty Creek and set up in the saloon for 2 days to hear any legal matters requiring his attention, which was a semi-regular occurrence. And among the things he heard was a land dispute between a rancher named Hollies and two Apache families who had been using a water source on the edge of Hollies' claimed land for longer than Hollies had been in Texas. The judge heard the testimony with the particular efficiency of a man with a lot of territory to cover and not enough time, and ruled in Hollies' favor, and the Apache families were told to find another water source, which in a dry summer was a cruelty the matter-of-fact delivery could not disguise. Cecil was present for this, and he came home from town with a quiet anger that he carried for several days. He talked with Gertrude about it in the evenings, and she listened and understood, because she had been thinking about injustice in her own way, about the injustice of being foreign and female in a country that had opinions about both those things. And she knew that her experience was different in kind and magnitude from what the Apache families faced. But she also understood the particular feeling of being in a place that has decided, in advance, what you are allowed to have and what you are not. "You cannot fix what the judge decided," she said one evening. "No," he agreed. "But the creek on our east edge runs year-round, and it is on our land, and the fence does not run all the way to it." "It does not have to." She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "No, it does not have to." He never made a production of it or spoke about it openly, but the fence on the east edge stayed the way it was. The years built themselves on each other the way years do, each one containing its own particular texture of weather and work and small crises and unexpected joys. Edward grew from a baby into a small boy who ran in the yard and chased the chickens, and spoke both French and English, with the serene interchangeability of someone for whom language had never been a barrier, because he had been born into a house where two languages lived side by side as naturally as morning and afternoon. A second child came in 1882, a girl they named Cecil, a name that contained both of theirs, which was a piece of deliberate poetry that made Father Beaulieu, hearing it at the baptism, press his lips together and look at the ceiling of the church for a moment to collect himself. By 1883, the house had grown. Cecil had added a second bedroom and a proper parlor and a covered porch that now ran all the way around two sides of the house, and Gertrude had made curtains for all of it, proper curtains this time, not the hastily hung ones from Cecil's first attempt, with a blue fabric she had ordered from a catalog that matched, approximately, the color of the sky on a clear Texas morning. There was a real kitchen garden and a small orchard of peach trees that she had planted as saplings 3 years earlier, and which had produced their first proper fruit that summer, small and sweet and tasting like something earned. The town of Dusty Creek had grown too, from 300 people to closer to 500, with a new hotel and a schoolhouse that was larger than the old one, and which Edward would attend in the fall. There was talk of a railroad spur, which would change everything, and which the town regarded with the mixed feelings of a place that has grown comfortable with its own isolation and is not entirely certain it wants to be connected. Cecil's ranch had expanded as well, from 40 acres to 60, and he had a hired hand now, a young man of 22 named Thomas Briggs, who was from Tennessee and who had arrived in Dusty Creek with nothing, and had proven himself reliable, and had become something close to family over time, eating supper at their table most evenings and learning, over the course of 2 years, enough French to get by when Gertrude was talking quickly and forgot to translate. One October evening in 1883, 5 years almost exactly after Gertrude had stepped off the stagecoach into Dusty Creek's dust and heat and enormous sky, Cecil found her on the front porch in the early evening, sitting in the chair she had claimed as her own on account of it having the best angle for the sunset, and he sat in his own chair beside her, and they watched the sky go through its colors, the orange and the pink and the deep red along the horizon and the blue deepening above. Edward was inside, engaged in some energetic project that involved a significant amount of noise. Cecil was asleep already. Thomas had gone back to the bunkhouse. The evening was theirs. "Do you remember," Cecil said in French, When I could not say a single word to you." She looked at him, and her expression was warm and amused and full of something else, something layered and permanent. "I remember," she said. "You said bonjour and you looked very serious about it." "I practiced it for a week," he said. "I know," she said. "Father Beaulieu told me." He laughed. "Of course he did." The sky went through another shade. A nighthawk called somewhere over the creek. She reached over and put her hand over his on the arm of his chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers. "Cecil," she said. "Yes." "Do you remember what you asked me when I stood in the middle of this house the first time, before we were married?" "I asked if you would stay," he said. "Yes," she said. "And I said yes because I thought I was saying yes to the house, to the country, to the life. I did not know yet that what I was actually saying yes to was you, the person you turned out to be." He was quiet for a moment. The sky was going dark at its edges. "If you had known then," he said carefully, "would you still have said yes?" She turned to look at him fully. This man with the Creekwater eyes and the French he had built word by word for her, and the hands that were never still when there was something to be made or mended. This man who had been honest with her from the first letter and had never stopped being honest, who had come to meet her at the stagecoach with his hat in his hands and his heart in his eyes, even when he did not have a single word to say to her. "Yes," she said. "I would have said yes faster." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, not in the formal way of a French greeting, but in the private way of a man who has spent 5 years learning everything about one woman's hands, the way they look when she is concentrating, when she is happy, when she is worried, when she is making pastry or mending clothes or writing letters to her brothers back in Lyon. The stars were coming out, the particular stars of a clear Texas October night, more than enough to count by, too many to count. Somewhere inside the house, Edouard had stopped his project and was now, from the sounds of it, engaged in an argument with the cat about something, which was a kind of conversation that required no translation. "I want to tell you something," Cecil said. She looked at him. "I learned French because I did not want you to be alone in a world where no one could understand you," he said, speaking in French with the ease of someone for whom it had become, genuinely, a second language, something that lived in him now and was his. But somewhere in the learning it stopped being about that. It became about wanting to understand you, not just the words, you, the way you think, the things you love. The way you say something in French when you are tired, or when something has moved you and it comes out in your real voice, the one you have when you are not being careful. She was very still. "I wanted to be someone who could hear your real voice," he said, "and I am glad I learned, not because it helped you, though I hope it did, because it let me know you, all of you." The silence between them was the comfortable kind, the silence of two people who have said enough and know it. "You know what I love most about you," she said after a while. "What?" "That you learned every word I said," she said. "Not just the vocabulary, every word I said." He looked at her in the starlight and she looked back at him. And they had been married 5 years and knew each other with the knowledge that comes only from time and daily proximity, and choosing each other through hard seasons and easy ones. And the love between them was not the bright, urgent thing it had been in those first weeks. It was larger now and quieter and more sure of itself. It had the quality of the creek on the east edge of the ranch, which ran clear and steady year-round and could be counted on. He stood up and offered her his hand, and she took it, and they went inside, into the warm house with the fire going and the children and the cat, and the curtains she had made from blue fabric and the herbs on the kitchen windowsill that smelled, on certain evenings, like Lyon. The railroad spur did come to Dusty Creek in the spring of 1884, and it changed things the way railroads always do, bringing new people and new commerce and a noise and speed that the town was still getting used to. The hotel expanded, a bank was established, a new family from St. Louis opened a dry goods emporium that made Horace Webb work harder than he had in years, and made him, in the process, modernize his store in ways he would not have done without the competition, which improved things for everyone. Gertrude saw an opportunity she had been thinking about for 2 years. She went to the bank in the fall of 1884 and applied for a small business loan, a request that the new bank manager, a careful man named Morton, regarded with the particular discomfort of a man whose experience did not include loans to women, and she sat across the desk from him and presented her proposal in English that was, by this point, clear and precise and entirely confident, and she described the business she intended to open. A small sewing and alteration shop that would also carry imported French fabrics and trimmings that she could source through a contact in New Orleans. Morton said he would need to think about it. He also said in the careful language of a man hedging his position that he would need to speak with her husband. She said in the same clear, precise English, "My husband supports this venture, but this is my loan and my business, and I would prefer to discuss it with you directly." Morton looked at her for a moment and then, to his credit, nodded. "Fair enough," he said. "Come back Friday." She had the loan by the end of October. Cecil had indeed supported the venture enthusiastically and had offered to help her renovate the small storefront she had found on the main street of Dusty Creek, which he did on weekends with Thomas Briggs helping, and which Edward, now 5, got in the way of constantly and helpfully. The shop opened in January of 1885 and was a success from the first month, because Gertrude had correctly assessed that the women of Dusty Creek and the surrounding ranches had been making do with whatever fabric was available locally for years and were hungry for something finer, and her eye for fabric and her skill with a needle were things she had grown up with and which were, she was discovering, genuinely rare. Josephine Beaumont from down the road helped in the shop 2 days a week, and they talked in French all day while they worked, and their customers listened to it and found, most of them, that the sound of it was pleasant, like music in a different key. Rosa Garza, the blacksmith's wife, came in one April afternoon with a worn dress and asked if it could be made to look new, and Gertrude examined it carefully and said, in Spanish, one of the approximately 40 words of Spanish she had assembled over the years, "Sí, puedo, yes, I can," and Rosa Garza laughed and embraced her with the warmth of a woman who has found, unexpectedly, someone who has been paying attention all along. By 1885, Gertrude's English was indistinguishable in practice from that of any educated woman of the frontier. It was accented always. Her French accent was not going anywhere, and she did not want it to. It was part of who she was, and she had stopped apologizing for it around the same time she stopped apologizing for anything else that was simply true about her. But she spoke it freely and well, and with a vocabulary that was sometimes surprising in its precision, because she had learned it from books as well as from conversation, and sometimes used a word that made her American neighbors blink, and then reach for a better way of expressing what they had been trying to say. Cecil's French was, by this point, something remarkable in a Texas cowboy. Father Beaulieu, when he was feeling particularly satisfied with his own work, would sometimes describe Cecil to visitors as his finest student, which Cecil found both flattering and slightly embarrassing, and which was, in any case, accurate. He did not speak it perfectly. His accent was always going to be Texas. There was nothing to be done about that, but he spoke it the way he spoke English, directly and without unnecessary decoration. And when he and Gertrude were alone, they moved between both languages so fluidly that they had stopped noticing which one they were in, which was perhaps the truest measure of what they had built. A third child came in the winter of 1886, another boy, whom they named Henry, after no one in particular but because the name suited him, and who arrived in the world at 3 in the morning during an ice storm with Clara Abbott, who had come to help, saying encouraging things in a loud voice, and Father Beaulieu sitting in the parlor praying in Latin, which was his default response to anything serious. Cecil sat in the parlor with Father Beaulieu during the hours of labor, and could not sit still, and could not do anything useful, and drank 4 cups of coffee, and talked to the priest in alternating French and English about nothing in particular, just to have something to do with his mouth while his heart was in the other room. When Clara came to the parlor doorway and said, "You've got another boy," Cecil walked into the bedroom and looked at Gertrude, who was exhausted and bright-eyed and holding Henry, who was red-faced and indignant in the way of all newly arrived people. And Cecil sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they looked at their son together. "Henry," she said softly. "Henry," he agreed. She looked up at him. Her hair was loose, and her eyes were tired, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, in the specific way that a person is beautiful when you have loved them for years and they are themselves, completely and without performance. "Merci," she said, which meant thank you, and he understood that she was not thanking him for anything specific but for everything, for all of it, for the letter and the flowers and the French lessons and the curtains and the room added to the house, and every morning in 5 years when he had gotten up and done the work and been there. "Non," he said. "C'est moi qui te remercie. No, it is I who thank you." The years after Henry's birth were settled and full years, the kind of years that do not make dramatic stories but that are, in the living of them, the whole point. The ranch grew to 80 acres with the purchase of an adjacent parcel in 1887. The shop on Main Street expanded into the space next door when the previous tenant moved on. Edward started school and turned out to have a gift for mathematics that came from somewhere neither of his parents could claim. Cecil grew into a girl with her mother's steady gaze and her father's stubbornness, a combination that was, in a daughter, both a challenge and a private source of delight to both her parents. Henry was a different creature altogether from his siblings, a child who appeared to have come into the world in a state of complete sociability, making friends with everyone who came near the ranch, the hired hands and the neighbors' children and the various animals, and memorably, the circuit judge when he passed through in 1889 and stopped at the ranch for water, and who left an hour later having had his ear talked off by a 3-year-old in 2 languages simultaneously. Father Beaulieu died in the spring of 1888, peacefully, in his bed at the rectory, at the age of 75, and the whole town of Dusty Creek attended his funeral, which was conducted by a new priest from San Antonio who did not speak French and read the Latin Mass with a Texas accent that Father Beaulieu would have had opinions about. Cecil and Gertrude sat in the front pew with their children, and Gertrude held Cecil's hand throughout and after, and they walked away from the church in the spring sunshine with the knowledge that the man who had been the bridge between them in the very beginning was gone, and that they no longer needed a bridge, had not needed one for years, but that the debt they owed him was real and permanent, and would be honored by the fact of everything they had built. "He told me," Gertrude said, walking home, "in that first week when he translated your question about whether I wanted to see the ranch, he said to me in French quietly so you would not hear, 'This man is worth the trouble of learning his language.'" Cecil looked at her. "He never told me that." "He was right," she said. "He was often right." "I never told him that either," Cecil said. She squeezed his hand. He knew. By 1890, Dusty Creek had become a proper town, with 2 churches and a school that went through the 8th grade, and a newspaper that was published weekly, and which had once in 1889 run a small feature on Gertrude's shop, calling her "a touch of European elegance in our frontier community," a description she found slightly excessive but which Clara Abbott, who was still alive at 64 and still running her boarding house, clipped and kept and showed to anyone who came to stay. Gertrude still wrote to her brothers in Lyon twice a year and received letters in return, long letters in French that she read aloud to Cecil in the evenings, translating as she went and then realizing, somewhere in the middle of each one, that she had stopped translating and was just reading, and Cecil was following it without any help, nodding at the right moments, asking questions in French when something was unclear. And she would look at him and feel that particular warmth that had been living in her chest since a December morning in 1878, when she had stood in his 2-room house and decided to stay. Her brothers had visited once in 1887, making the long journey with their wives, and had arrived in Dusty Creek with the expressions of men who had been prepared to be alarmed and were trying to remain open-minded. They had seen the ranch and the house, which by then had 4 rooms and a proper kitchen and the covered porch and the orchard of peach trees. And they had met Cecil, who had shaken their hands and spoken to them in French that was, quite frankly, better than either of them had expected from a Texas cowboy. And they had eaten supper at the long table with the children and Thomas Briggs and Clara Abbott, who had come over for the occasion. And by the second evening the elder brother, Jean-Pierre, had pulled Cecil aside and said, in French, something that Gertrude only heard second-hand from Cecil later, something to the effect of, "We were worried about her, and we were wrong to worry, and we are grateful to you." Cecil, who was not a man who required anyone's approval, had nevertheless been more moved by this than he expected and had said, "She made her own choice, and she makes everything here better, and I am the one who is grateful." In 1891, Gertrude Carson, 12 years old, bilingual and mathematically gifted, announced that he intended to go to university when he was old enough, which was not a statement that 12-year-olds in Dusty Creek typically made, and which Cecil and Gertrude received with the combination of surprise and complete lack of surprise that characterizes parents who have been watching their child carefully for years. "Where?" Cecil asked. "I don't know yet," Gertrude said, with the confidence of someone who has identified the destination and has not yet concerned himself with the route. Gertrude looked at her son across the supper table, this boy who had grown up between 2 languages and 2 worlds and who carried both of them easily, the way he carried everything, with a kind of cheerful certainty. "You will figure it out," she said, in French, because it was what she said to her children when they said things she believed completely. Cecil, 8 years old, said, "I am going to have a shop, a bigger shop than Mama's." Henry, 5 years old, said, "I am going to have horses." Cecil looked around the table at all of them and felt something so large he could not hold it in his chest alone, something that spilled over into his face and his hands, and made him put down his fork and just look at his family for a moment. This thing he had built that was nothing like what he had imagined when he was a young man alone on 40 acres thinking about what a life was supposed to look like. Gertrude saw his face and understood it completely. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his and then went back to her supper, because she knew he did not need her to say anything, and because she felt exactly the same way, and they had, over 13 years of marriage, developed the particular communication of 2 people who know each other well enough to share a feeling without a word. The autumn of 1891 came with a good harvest and a cold that arrived early, and a sense of settled rightness that was its own kind of weather. Gertrude sat at her kitchen table one September evening after the children were in bed and wrote a letter to her brother Jean-Pierre in Lyon. And she wrote it in French and described the summer and the shop and the children and the state of the ranch and the quality of the peaches from the orchard that year. And then she wrote something that she had not planned to write, that came out of her pen of its own accord. She wrote, "I have been thinking about why I came here and whether I would do it again, and I think the honest answer is that I did not know what I was doing when I came. I only knew what I was leaving, and that the courage, if it was courage, was less than it seemed from the outside. What took actual courage was staying. What took actual courage was choosing, every day, to be here, in this country that is not the one I was born in, with this man who is not what I imagined but is better, with these children who are both of us and neither of us and entirely themselves. I have had to learn a new language, and not just English. I have had to learn the language of this land and of this marriage and of this family, and those languages took longer than English and were harder, and I am still learning all of them. But I am not homesick anymore, Jean-Pierre. I do not mean that I have forgotten Lyon or stopped loving it or stopped loving you. I mean that home has changed its location. Home is here. Home has been here for a long time. I think I have just finally found the right words to say it." She sealed the letter and put it with the others to go to town in the morning, and she sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen with the smell of the herbs on the windowsill and the last of the fire in the stove. And then Cecil came in from checking on the horses, and she looked up at him, and he looked at her, and he said in French, "You look like you have been thinking." "I was writing to Jean-Pierre," she said. "What did you tell him?" She thought about the letter and about the right answer and then said, in English, because some things she still preferred in English, the language she had built for herself here. "I told him I am happy." He came and sat across from her and looked at her the way he looked at things he was being careful with, the way he looked at the creek in spring when he was deciding whether to ford it, with attention and respect and the knowledge that something real was in front of him. "Are you?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Completely." He was quiet for a moment and then said, in French, which was where the serious thing still went for him, the language he had learned in order to reach her, and which had therefore always been associated in some deep part of him with the act of reaching. "So am I. I did not know I was capable of it before you came. I did not know what it felt like." She looked at him in the kitchen light, this man who had put her photograph on his fireplace mantel for 4 months before she arrived, and who had stood on the boardwalk with his hat in his hands, and who had spent weeks learning bonjour, and then months learning everything else, and who had never, in 13 years, stopped learning the language she spoke in all its forms, the French and the English and the particular Gertrude that was neither and both. "You learned every word I said," she said, which was something she had said to him once before, years ago on the porch in the starlight, and which was still true and always would be. "I learned every word you said," he agreed. "And I am not finished. You are still talking." She laughed, and he smiled, and the kitchen was warm and the children were asleep, and the Texas night was enormous and full of stars outside the windows. And they sat across from each other at the table where they had eaten 10,000 meals and had 10,000 conversations in 2 languages and 1 life. And the candle burned between them, and there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left unanswered, nothing left that had not been said or built or grown or given or received. Only the ordinary miracle of everything still ahead of them, all the morning still to come on the porch watching the sky go through its colors, all the suppers at the long table with the children and the cat, and the sound of 2 languages moving through a house like something alive, all the years still to be added to the years already there, piled up like stones in a wall that was solid and standing and built to last. Dusty Creek in the autumn of 1891 was not the same town that had watched a French woman step off a stagecoach 13 years before with a leather valise and a burgundy dress and 12 words of English. It had grown and changed and complicated itself, the way places do when people keep arriving and adding themselves to what was already there. And Gertrude Hart Carson had grown and changed with it, had become part of its texture. Her shop on Main Street and her kitchen garden and her peach orchard and her 3 bilingual children, all of it woven into the fabric of the place as genuinely as anything else that had been there longer. And Cecil Carson, who had once been a man alone on 40 acres in a house with uneven curtains and no one to talk to, was a man with a ranch and a family and 2 languages, and a life so full it sometimes stopped him where he was standing, in the barn or the field or the kitchen, just stopped him and made him look around at what was there, at all of it, and feel the weight and the grace of it settle into him. On the last evening of September 1891, the whole family ate supper together on the porch, which they did whenever the weather allowed, and the peach trees in the orchard were dropping their last leaves, and the sky was doing what it always did in October, going gold and deep and extraordinary, and Edward was explaining something at length to Henry about mathematics, and Henry was listening with approximately a third of his attention. And Cecil was making a small house out of sticks for no particular reason, except that she had seen one in a book and wanted to understand how it worked. And Gertrude and Cecil sat at either end of the long table and looked at their children, and at each other end. At the sunset in the order that presented itself. "Mama," Edward said, interrupting his own explanation, "how did you know you wanted to come to Texas?" She considered the question seriously, because Edward was 12 and asked real questions and deserved real answers. I did not know I wanted to come to Texas specifically, she said. In the English she spoke to her children, mixed always with French, so they grew up holding both. I knew I wanted to go somewhere. I had a feeling that there was a door open somewhere and I needed to walk through it. But what if it had been the wrong door? Edward said. She looked at Cecil at the other end of the table, and he was looking back at her with those Creekwater eyes and the expression she knew better than her own face. Then it would have been the wrong door, she said, and I would have found another one, but it was not the wrong door. It was exactly the right one. Edward considered this with the seriousness of a 12-year-old who is filing information away for future use. Henry went back to his mathematics lesson with a renewed and probably short-lived attention. Cecil's stick house collapsed, and she started building it again. Cecil reached across the table and put his hand over Gertrude's, and she turned her hand over and held his, the way she had held it 100 times on this porch and 100 times elsewhere. And the sun went down over Texas in the colors that had no names, and the stars came out one by one over the ranch and the creek and the orchard and the house with the proper curtains, and everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. And the story of the mail-order bride and the cowboy who learned her language had arrived at last at the place all true stories arrive at when they are lived right. Not an ending exactly, but a fullness, a completion, a life filled up to its edges and still going, still speaking in two tongues and one voice, still learning every word.